Ever kind of stop and think of like, how much of our world is just data now? It's like back in 2000, most stuff was physical papers, actual photos, things.
Yeah, it's true. Easy to forget how fast things have changed.
Right. Get this.
Yeah.
By 2013, only 2% of information wasn't digital. That's wild, right? So no wonder it feels like we're just wading through data constantly. That's why we're doing this deep dive today, the datafication of society. Basically what it means to live in a world where, well, pretty much everything's turning into data points.
And the really interesting thing is how this hits us from all sides, right? It's not just tech anymore. It's social, economic. I mean, even anthropologists are looking at this stuff.
Okay, so before we fall down the digital rabbit hole, can we define data quickly?
Yeah.
Because it sounds like it's more than just like spreadsheets and ones and zeros. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. One way to think about it, imagine raw ingredients. Flour, sugar, eggs. Doesn't make a cake on its own, right?
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Data's the same. Without context, without us actually doing something to it, it's meaningless. It's when we process it that it becomes information, knowledge, and ultimately, well, yeah, something companies can really use.
So like when we hear about those huge companies collecting tons of data, it's only valuable if they know how to, bake it into something.
Exactly. And I think that's an important thing for all of us to remember. We're not the product. Our processed information is.
Wow, that's actually a good way to look at it. It's not just about having the data, it's what you do with it. Speaking of which, I was surprised to learn there are tons of different types of data. Like the lecture notes talked about primary and secondary data.
Right. It's kind of like doing your own research versus using research that already exists. Primary data is what you collect yourself, interviews, surveys, that kind of thing.
So if I was researching, say, population trends, and I used like government census data, that'd be secondary since someone else collected it.
Exactly. You're using existing data to maybe answer a new question or look at things from a different angle.
That's pretty handy. And then there's this other thing, metadata. Sounds kind of mysterious, honestly.
Right. It's less about mystery and more about context, really. Like, imagine finding a recipe, right? But it doesn't tell you when to add each ingredient.
Oh, that'd be so frustrating.
Right. Metadata is like those missing instructions. Tells you things like when the data was even gathered, what the categories mean, so you know how to use the raw data correctly.
Okay, that makes way more sense. So we've got these types of data, but then there's this whole big data thing. It's practically a buzzword at this point.
Yeah. It feels like everywhere you turn, there's some article about the latest big data breakthrough. But is it really that different from just, having a ton of data? Like, what's the big deal?
It's a good question because the amount itself is definitely part of it, but it's not just how much data there is. It's also the speed, right? Like it's being generated constantly now, every click, every swipe, all those sensors. And then on top of that, there's the variety, your shopping habits online, your Fitbit tracking, it all gets thrown in together.
Okay, so fast, varied. I can see how that'd be a game changer for anyone doing research, especially in those social sciences that the lecture notes were talking about. Oh, absolutely. Totally different ballgame now. I mean, think about it in the past. You might have surveyed 1,000 people to try and understand some trend. Now, researchers can look at data from literally millions of people, finding patterns that you'd just never spot before.
That's kind of mind-blowing when you really think about it, but also seems like it'd be really easy to, misinterpret things or jump to conclusions, right?
Oh, for sure. That's a really important point. And actually, one of the key things the lecture notes brought up was this shift with big data. It's less about causation and more about correlation now.
Can you break that down for me a little? What's the difference, really?
Yeah. So traditionally, research, a lot of it anyway, was trying to prove that one thing directly caused another. Like, does playing violent video games cause aggressive behavior? Classic example. But with big data, we might see that, people who buy a certain type of energy drink are also more likely to play those games. That's a correlation, but doesn't mean one caused the other, right?
Okay, so it's more like finding clues, but not necessarily solving the whole mystery.
Exactly. So you got to be super careful about how you interpret things. Big data can show you fascinating connections, for sure. But it's not some, magic crystal ball or anything.
Right. Correlation is not causation. Definitely going to remember that one. So, okay, we've got all this data. We're getting better at analyzing it. But where does datafication itself fit in?
So this is where we move beyond just having data and into actually turning everything into data. It's your fitness tracker, knowing how you sleep. It's your smart home, learning your routines. It's those weirdly specific ads that are like reading your mind.
Okay, now that you mention it, those hyper-specific ads are starting to feel a little less like magic and a little more dot creepy.
Yeah.
Like, how do they know I was just looking at those shoes online?
Well, that brings us to the, shall we say, the elephant in the room.
Algorithms.
Algorithms, right. Everyone throws that word around. But I'll be honest, still seems kind of like a magic spell to me.
Uh-huh. Fair enough. Think of it like a recipe, maybe. You've got ingredients, that's your data, and then you've got instructions for what to do with those ingredients, that's your algorithm. Okay, so if the data is like all the stuff you need to bake a cake, the algorithm's the set of steps that tells the computer how to actually bake it.
Perfect analogy. And just like recipes, algorithms can be simple or super complex. But the main thing is, they're shaping so much of our online world now.
So not just baking cakes, but deciding which social media posts I see, which products Amazon suggests.
And potentially even more than that, yeah. Leading to this whole idea of algorithmic culture even.
Okay, that one sounds kind of ominous. What's that all about?
So basically the idea is that algorithms are kind of taking on roles that used to be filled by, well, human culture, like sorting information, classifying it, figuring out what's important. But they're doing it in ways we don't always see based on rules we don't totally get.
So it's like having this digital gatekeeper deciding what we see and don't see online.
Exactly. And that leads us right into the infamous filter bubble problem. That feeling that we're only seeing stuff that already matches what we believe. Remember that Mark Zuckerberg quote about the squirrel?
Oh, yeah. Something about a squirrel dying in his yard and Facebook not showing it to him because the algorithm was like, nah, he doesn't care about that.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And I mean, on the surface, getting personalized recommendations sounds great, right? Who wouldn't want to see more stuff they're into? Problem is, it can create these echo chambers where you're never exposed to different opinions, different information.
So it's not just missing out on cute squirrel videos. It's about having this, like, skewed view of the world, potentially. And the lecture notes mentioned some pretty serious issues with this whole filter bubble thing.
Right, yeah. They highlighted 4 main problems. First, there's the invisibility. We often don't even realize we're in a filter bubble to begin with. Then there's the lack of control, like we don't get to choose what gets filtered out or how those decisions are made. And then there's the opacity of it. I mean, all these algorithms are often treated like big secrets, so it's tough to address any biases they might have.
So we're kind of at the mercy of these algorithms without even really knowing how they work. And what was the fourth issue?
Right. The fourth one, and maybe the most worrying one, is the increasing power these things have. The more data they get, the smarter they become, and the more influence they have over our choices, our worldviews. It's a bit of a cycle.
It's a little creepy when you put it like that. This idea that our whole online experience, and maybe even our offline lives, are being shaped by these invisible forces.
And it's not just us as individuals either. This all ties into the bigger concept of social media logic, which is a whole other...
Okay, yeah, I've heard that term, but what does it actually mean? Like, how is it different from regular old media logic?
So traditionally, media logic was about how different types of media, like newspapers or TV, presented information. But social media, it's a whole new ballgame with its own set of rules.
And the lecture notes broke it down into 4 main principles: programmability, popularity, connectivity, and then obviously datafication, which we've been talking about. But what about those other 3? Can you give us the rundown?
Yeah, so programmability. It's basically how these social media platforms are designed, often very intentionally to, well, kind of mess with how we act. Like, think about those little notification pop-ups or that endless scroll thing. Even the colors they use, the sounds.
It's like they're trying to, like, hack our brains to keep us scrolling, right?
Exactly. It's playing on our psychology, making it really hard to log off, even when we know we should.
So that's programmability. What about popularity? Where does that fit into this whole social media logic thing?
Oh man, social media thrives on popularity. Likes, shares, retweets, it's all about those metrics. And they use algorithms to push the stuff that's already popular, making it even more popular, like a snowball effect almost.
So it's not even really about if the information's good or accurate. It's just how much buzz it creates.
Yeah, a lot of the time, unfortunately, the stuff that goes viral kind of overshadows everything else, even if it's more important or nuanced. And then there's connectivity. That's the glue that holds it all together. Social media connects us to each other, to information, and of course to all those advertisers with their very specific ads.
And I'm guessing the more connected we are, the more data they can gather about us, right?
Bingo. Which then fuels those targeted ads and those personalized recommendations we talked about, which keeps us hooked, which gives them more data. It's a whole cycle.
It's honestly kind of brilliant from like a business point of view,
Hmm.
but it does feel like something's getting lost in the process, you know? Like we're so bombarded with stuff, so caught up in this whole engagement cycle that it's hard to even think for yourself sometimes.
Yeah, and that's a concern for a lot of people researching this stuff, for sure. As more and more of our lives get turned into data, as algorithms get more and more influence over what we see and do online, it's a good time to ask ourselves, what does that mean for our own autonomy? Our ability to think critically and make our own choices?
It's a real double-edged sword. We've got more information at our fingertips than ever before, but it's also easier than ever to get stuck in those echo chambers. Our opinions shaped by these forces we don't really understand.
And that's exactly why it's so important to be aware of how this stuff works, to engage with technology thoughtfully. It's not about ditching social media entirely, but being a smarter consumer, a more aware citizen in this, increasingly datafied world.
So it's not about unplugging, it's about plugging in more mindfully, like questioning what we see, trying to find different viewpoints, remembering that these algorithms, they're not always on our side.
100%. Knowledge is power, right? The more we get how datafication and algorithms actually work, the better we are at navigating it all and making choices that feel right for us.
Well said. That gives me a lot to think about, and I'm sure it's the same for everyone listening. It's not every day we get to really dig into such a, honestly, kind of a complex and constantly changing topic.
It's been great exploring it with you.
And there you have it, folks. Your deep dive into the datafication of society. We've covered how data is changing everything, from those algorithms behind the scenes to what it even means to live in a world where everything's getting quantified.
Huh.
But hey, the future's not written yet, right? And by understanding these forces that are at play, we can all help shape a digital future that works for everyone.